Hey there. Tonight we're going back, way back, to explore why life was brutal for women in ancient Egypt. It's a story of surprising rights and relentless hardship, perfect for you to unwind to, or just drift away. If you enjoy these calm historical journeys, feel free to leave a comment with where you are listening from. It's always nice to know where our fellow history travelers are settling in for the night, and maybe subscribe for more. We're going to discover a world far more complex than the golden masks and towering pyramids suggest. So just get comfortable, close your eyes, and imagine the first hint of light is just beginning to touch the horizon, casting a pale, dusty rose hue over the flat-roofed houses of a small village nestled along the banks of the great river. You are here, in a time before our time, and the day is about to begin. The air is still cool from the desert night, a temporary and precious relief from the heat that will soon descend and bake the earth. You're lying on a reed mat, perhaps over a thin mattress stuffed with straw, and the surface is familiar in its slight scratchiness against your skin. It's not uncomfortable, just real. The floor beneath you is hard-packed earth, cool to the touch. The sounds are soft, muted. The gentle rustle of your family sleeping nearby, a soft sigh from your mother, the rhythmic, heavy breathing of your father. Outside, the world is still quiet, but not silent. You can hear the distant, lonely bray of a donkey, and perhaps the very first chirps of the birds that live in the papyrus reeds along the water's edge. The smell is a complex mix of dry earth, old linen, the lingering scent of wood smoke from last night's cooking fire, and something else, something faintly sweet and dusty, the smell of life itself in this ancient land. This is your home. It's a simple structure, made of mud bricks baked in the relentless sun. The walls are thick, designed to keep out the worst of the day's heat, but they are also porous, breathing with the landscape. There are no grand windows, only small, high openings to let in a sliver of light and a breath of air while keeping out the swirling dust and the glare. In the dimness, you can just make out the shapes of your world. A few clay pots leaning against a wall, a wooden chest holding the family's most valued possessions, which aren't many, and the simple, low-slung furniture. It's a sparse existence, but it's everything. There's a certain comfort in its predictability, in the way the morning light will soon trace the same path across the floor it did yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. Your life as a woman in this world is governed by cycles, great and small. The grandest, of course, is the cycle of the Nile, the river that is the very lifeblood of this civilization. Its annual flood, the Akhet, dictates everything: when to plant, when to harvest, and whether there will be abundance or scarcity. Then there is the cycle of the sun, Ra, in his celestial bark, sailing across the sky each day without fail, bringing both life-giving warmth and scorching, inescapable heat. And then there is your own cycle, the rhythm of your body, and the expectations placed upon it. From a very young age, you are aware that your destiny is intertwined with the creation of new life, with the continuation of your family line. It is a sacred duty, but also a profound and dangerous burden. Today, like most days, will begin with the same task. The very first chore, before the sun has truly risen, is the grinding of the grain. This is the foundation of every meal, the literal bedrock of your family's sustenance. In the corner of your small home, or perhaps in a shared courtyard, sits the instrument of this labor, the saddle quern. It's a simple thing, really. A large, slightly concave stone resting on the ground, and a smaller, rounded stone that you hold in your hands. You will kneel before it, your body already accustomed to the posture, and you will begin to grind. You take a handful of emmer wheat or barley, scattering it onto the large stone. Then, with the smaller stone, you begin to push forward and pull back, forward and back, using the weight of your upper body to crush the hard kernels into a coarse flour. The sound is a gritty, rhythmic scraping, a sound that has echoed through Egyptian homes for thousands of years. It's the soundtrack of the morning, the percussion of daily survival. At first, your muscles are stiff from sleep, your shoulders protesting the familiar strain, but soon you fall into the rhythm of the work. It's monotonous, yes. It is achingly, bone-wearingly monotonous. Your back will ache, your knees, pressed against the hard earth, will ache. Your arms and shoulders will burn with a familiar fire. This is not a task that takes a few minutes. To produce enough flour for the family's daily bread, you will be here for hours. Literally, hours. Archaeologists who have studied the skeletal remains of ancient Egyptian women often find evidence of this lifelong labor. Worn down knee joints, strained vertebrae, overdeveloped muscles in the arms and back. Their very bones tell the story of the saddle quern. As you grind, you might listen to the village waking up around you. The sounds grow from soft rustles to more distinct noises. A neighbor's baby begins to cry. You hear the lowing of a cow being led out to pasture. The murmur of voices grows, men preparing to go to the fields or to their workshops. Other women, in their own homes, are performing this exact same task, and the air fills with the collective scraping of stone on stone. It's a strange sort of symphony. There is no glory in this work. No pharaoh will write poems about the woman grinding grain. No grand tomb relief will celebrate your aching back. But without this, there is no bread. Without bread, there is no life. And so, you grind, forward and back, forward and back. The sun climbs higher, and the slivers of light coming through the high windows grow brighter, illuminating the fine dust of flour that now coats your hands, your arms, and hangs in the air, catching the light like a faint, ghostly mist. You breathe it in. It gets in your eyes, in your hair. It becomes a part of you. This is the reality behind the serene, stylized paintings you see on tomb walls. Behind the image of the graceful woman offering bread to the gods, there are the silent, uncounted hours of crushing labor that made the offering possible. And this is only the first task of a very, very long day. Once the grain is ground, a task that consumes the cool and precious hours of the early morning, the day's labor simply shifts its focus. The fine, dusty flour you've painstakingly created must now be turned into bread, the staple of the Egyptian diet. You might mix the coarse flour with water, and if you're lucky, a little yeast saved from a previous batch or some honey for a special occasion. Kneading the dough is another physical task, working the heavy, sticky mass with your hands and forearms until it has the right consistency. Your hands, already calloused from the grinding stone, work the dough on a simple wooden board or a clean spot on the floor. Then, the baking. Some households had small conical clay ovens in their courtyards, which had to be preheated with a fire of dried animal dung or wood. The smell of the burning fuel would mix with the scent of baking bread, a smell that was both comforting and constant. You would slap the flattened dough onto the hot interior walls of the oven, where it would cook quickly. For many poorer families without an oven, the bread might be cooked on a hot stone placed directly in the embers of the hearth, resulting in a dense, often gritty flatbread. And that grit was a serious matter. The flour itself, ground on a stone quern, was inevitably contaminated with tiny particles of sand and stone. This grit, consumed with every single meal, day after day, year after year, had a devastating effect on people's teeth. The dental evidence from Egyptian mummies is undeniable. Teeth worn down to the pulp, abscesses and chronic pain were the norm. So, as you chew your daily bread, you might feel the familiar crunch of sand, a constant reminder of the very earth you live on, an earth that both sustains and slowly wears you down. While the bread bakes, or perhaps while another female family member takes over that task, your next journey is about to begin. The trip to the Nile. Water is life, but it is also heavy, and it does not come to you. You must go to it. You and the other women and older children of the village would gather your large clay pots, balancing them expertly on your heads or shoulders. These pots themselves were heavy even when empty, and once filled with water from the river, they would be a significant weight to carry back to your home, sometimes over a considerable distance. The walk to the riverbank is a social event, in its own way. It's a chance to leave the confines of the small, dark house and be out in the growing light of day. It's a time for talk, for gossip, for sharing news and complaints. You would see your friends, your cousins, your aunts. You'd catch up on the latest birth, the newest squabble between neighbors, the health of the village elder. It was the village grapevine, a network of information passed along the paths to the river. The banks of the Nile are a hive of activity. Fishermen are mending their nets. Children are splashing in the shallows, a dangerous game, given the crocodiles that lurked in the deeper waters. And animals are being brought to drink. The air smells of wet mud, papyrus reeds, and fish. You wade into the cool water, feeling the soft, silt squish between your toes. And here, you face another invisible threat. The water of the Nile, so essential for life, is teeming with parasites. The most notorious of these is the schistosoma worm, which enters the body through the skin. The resulting disease, schistosomiasis, would have been a chronic condition for many Egyptians, causing internal bleeding, anemia, and a lifetime of lethargy and pain. You wouldn't know the scientific reason for it, of course. You would only know the feeling of constant tiredness, the blood in your urine that was so common it was sometimes mistaken for a form of male menstruation. You would attribute it to the will of the gods, or perhaps a curse from an enemy. But it was simply a consequence of living so intimately with the river. You fill your pot, hoisting the now enormous weight up to your head, using a coiled cloth pad to cushion the load. The journey back is slower, more deliberate. Your neck and spine take the strain. You walk with a straight-backed, gliding gait that is the hallmark of a life spent carrying heavy loads. This journey for water is not a once-a-day affair. You would make this trip multiple times, for drinking, for cooking, for washing. Water was a constant, heavy, and necessary burden. Back at home, the day's work continues its relentless pace. If you have a small plot of land, you might tend to the vegetable garden, growing onions, garlic, lettuce, and beans. You might be responsible for the family's livestock, a cow, a few goats, or some geese. This means feeding them, milking them, and cleaning their enclosures. Then there is the endless task of weaving. Linen was the primary fabric of ancient Egypt, made from the fibers of the flax plant. The entire process, from processing the raw flax to spinning it into thread and then weaving it into cloth on a large, upright loom, was almost exclusively women's work. Spinning was a task that could be done almost anywhere. You might have a spindle that you could use while watching the children or keeping an eye on the cooking pot. You would tease out the flax fibers, twisting them into a consistent thread with a practiced, almost unconscious motion. Weaving, however, required more concentration and space. The loom, often dominating a room or a shaded part of the courtyard, required you to stand for hours, passing the shuttle back and forth, your arms moving in a steady, repetitive motion. The fine quality of Egyptian linen was famous throughout the ancient world, but that quality was born from the patience and skill of countless unnamed women working in the dim light of their homes. All of this work, grinding grain, baking bread, carrying water, tending gardens, raising animals, spinning thread, weaving cloth, was done while also being the primary caregiver for the children. And families were often large. The expectation for a woman in ancient Egypt was, above all else, to be a mother. A wife, yes, but her value to her husband and to society was intrinsically linked to her ability to produce children, particularly sons to carry on the family name and to perform the necessary funerary rites for his parents. This pressure began at a very young age. While we have this image of ancient Egypt as a monolithic, unchanging civilization, it's important to remember that life expectancies were short. A person who lived to be 40 was considered to have reached a respectable old age. This reality compressed the timeline of life. Girls were not children for long. They would spend their early years learning the vast catalog of domestic tasks by watching and assisting their mothers and other female relatives. A young girl, perhaps only 5 or 6 years old, would be given small tasks, fetching things, watching a younger sibling, learning to shape a simple loaf of bread. By the time she was 10, she would be proficient in many of the core duties she would perform for the rest of her life. And marriage came early. Most girls were married shortly after they reached puberty, typically between the ages of 12 and 14. Their husbands were often not much older, perhaps 16 to 20. There was no room for the modern concept of a prolonged adolescence. Life was short, and the work of building a family had to begin quickly. Marriage was generally not a matter of romantic love as we might think of it, but a practical and economic arrangement between two families. A girl's father would choose a suitable husband for her, someone who could provide for her, and who came from a respectable family. While the girl's consent was not legally required, it's likely that her feelings were, in many cases, at least considered. But the ultimate decision rested with her male guardian. The marriage itself was a simple affair. There was no grand religious ceremony, The primary event was the woman simply moving from her father's house to her husband's house, often with a procession and a feast, if the families could afford it. She would bring with her a small dowry, perhaps some furniture, linens, or household goods, which would legally remain her own property. And then, almost immediately, the next great expectation would be upon her: pregnancy. To be barren was considered a terrible fate for a woman, a source of great personal shame and social stigma. It was a common reason for a man to take a second wife or to seek a divorce. So, from the moment of marriage, the hope and anxiety around conceiving a child would have been immense. A woman would pray to the goddesses associated with fertility, like Hathor, a powerful and multifaceted deity who was a protector of women, and Taweret, the strange and wonderful goddess who looked like a combination of a pregnant hippopotamus, a lion, and a crocodile. Taweret, despite her fearsome appearance, was a beloved and fiercely protective household deity, a guardian of pregnant women and newborn babies. Amulets bearing her image were worn by women everywhere, a small token of divine protection against the very real dangers that lay ahead. For childbirth was, without exaggeration, the most dangerous time in a woman's life. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Without modern medical knowledge of hygiene, obstetrics, or antibiotics, every birth was a life-threatening event. A woman would typically give birth at home, attended by her mother, aunts, and perhaps a local midwife. She would deliver her child in a squatting or kneeling position, sometimes on a special birthing stool or on a pile of heated bricks, to help with the process. The process was shrouded in a mixture of practical experience and magical belief. Spells would be recited to ward off evil demons who might try to harm the mother or child. Amulets would be placed around the room, but these could do little against the real threats: hemorrhage, infection, and prolonged, obstructed labor. We can only imagine the terror. A young woman, barely more than a girl herself, enduring hours of excruciating pain in a small hot room, surrounded by anxious female relatives, knowing that her life was hanging in the balance. The reliefs and paintings don't show this part. They show the happy result, the mother holding her healthy baby. They don't show the tragic, and far too common, alternative. A family tomb might contain the body of a young woman buried with her infant, a silent testament to a birth that ended in double tragedy. And if she survived the first birth, the cycle would begin again. Large families were the ideal, not just for sentimental reasons, but for practical ones. In an agricultural society, more children meant more hands to help with the work. But more importantly, high infant and child mortality rates meant that a woman had to have many children just to ensure that a few would survive to adulthood. It was a brutal calculus. A woman might experience 8, 10, or even more pregnancies over the course of her reproductive life. Each one carried the same life-threatening risks. Each one took a toll on her body. It was a continuous state of pregnancy, nursing, and then pregnancy again. A cycle that would leave her physically drained and perpetually vulnerable. The emotional toll is harder to measure, but it must have been immense. To love a child, to nurse it and care for it, only to lose it to a fever, a diarrheal disease, or some other common ailment for which there was no cure, was a grief that Egyptian women knew intimately. They mourned, of course. We have texts, laments, that express this deep sorrow. But it was also an accepted part of life. Death was not a distant stranger. It was a constant, familiar presence in every household. So, you can picture our young woman, Merit, now a wife and mother. Her days are still filled with the grinding of grain and the carrying of water, but now there is a baby strapped to her back or nursing at her breast. Her work is not lessened by motherhood. It is compounded. She is tired. Her body aches. She worries about her children's health. She prays to Taweret. She loves her family fiercely, and she knows that this cycle of labor, birth, and potential loss is her destiny, the fundamental truth of her existence. It was a life of incredible strength and resilience, but it was, by any measure, a brutal one. It's a fascinating paradox of ancient Egyptian society, that while a woman's daily life was one of relentless, grinding labor and physical hardship, her legal status was, in many ways, remarkably advanced for the ancient world. Compared to her contemporaries in ancient Greece, for instance, where women were legally perpetual minors under the control of a male guardian. The Egyptian woman held a surprising degree of autonomy, on paper at least. The core principle of Egyptian law was that women were legal equals to men. They could own property in their own right. This wasn't just a token allowance. It was a fundamental right. A woman could inherit land, livestock, servants, and goods from her parents, and she could inherit from her husband. What she owned was hers. She could manage it, rent it out, and, most importantly, she could sell it or bequeath it to whomever she wished. This gave women a measure of economic power that was almost unheard of elsewhere. We have legal documents, written on papyrus, that show women buying and selling property, making loans, and entering into contracts. A woman named Nonocte, from the village of Deir el-Medina, where the tomb builders lived, left behind a will in which she meticulously outlines which of her children will inherit her property and, just as importantly, which ones will not, because they failed to care for her in her old age. She was a woman of modest means, but she wielded her legal right to dispose of her property with absolute authority. Women could also run businesses. While most high-status professions were reserved for men, women were active in the economy, especially in areas related to their traditional domestic roles. They were brewers, bakers, and weavers, who sold their surplus goods in the local market. They could be professional mourners, hired to wail and lament at funerals, a respected and necessary role in Egyptian funerary customs. Some women of higher status could even hold the title of mistress of the house, which was not just a domestic title but an administrative one, implying she was the manager of a large and complex estate. They could also bring lawsuits in court. They could act as their own legal representatives, stand before a panel of judges, who were always men, and plead their own case. They could sue, and they could be sued. They were recognized as independent legal entities, not as extensions of their fathers or husbands. And then there was the matter of marriage and divorce. Marriage, as we've seen, was a private contract, and just as it could be entered into, it could be dissolved. Divorce was relatively common and socially acceptable. It could be initiated by either the husband or the wife. The standard formula was simple. One partner would stand up in a public place and declare, "I have divorced you," or "I am leaving you." The reasons for divorce were varied and often quite practical. Adultery, infertility, usually blamed on the wife, or simply what we might call irreconcilable differences. If a woman initiated the divorce, she was entitled to take her dowry back with her, as well as any property she had acquired during the marriage. If her husband divorced her, he was typically required to pay her a sort of alimony, a portion of his own wealth to support her. On the surface, this all sounds remarkably progressive. It suggests a world where women had significant control over their economic and personal lives. But there is a vast gulf between legal theory and lived reality. While these rights existed, how often could an ordinary woman, living a life of subsistence farming in a small village, actually exercise them? For a woman like our Merit, the right to own land was probably an abstract concept. Her family likely worked land owned by a temple or a wealthy nobleman, paying a portion of their harvest as rent. They may have owned their small house and a few tools, but the kind of wealth that would give a woman true economic independence was far beyond their reach. The ability to run a business was also limited by circumstance. A woman could sell a few extra loaves of bread or a length of cloth at the market, but this was supplemental income, not a pathway to financial freedom. Her primary, all-consuming job was the unpaid labor of her own household. And while the right to divorce was there, the practicalities were daunting. Where would a woman go? She could return to her father's house, but that would place an additional economic burden on her family. How would she support herself? Without a husband, she would lose her connection to the land they worked. She would be economically vulnerable, reliant on the charity of her male relatives. For a woman with children, the situation was even more complicated. Divorce would mean uprooting their lives, and her ability to provide for them would be severely diminished. So, while a woman might have been unhappy, or even in an abusive relationship, the decision to leave was not one to be taken lightly. The legal right was a safety net, but it was a net with very large holes. The social structure, despite the legal code, remained deeply patriarchal. The head of the household was the man. The most important public and official roles were held by men. The scribes who wrote the laws were men. The priests who interpreted the will of the gods were men. The pharaoh, with a few notable exceptions like Hatshepsut, was a man. A woman's world was primarily the domestic sphere, the house, the courtyard, the village well. Her influence was exercised within the family, not in the public square. This creates a kind of quiet tension in our understanding of ancient Egypt. It was a society that granted women more rights than many that would come after it for thousands of years. And yet, this did not necessarily translate into an easier life. It's like having the key to a car, but no fuel to make it run. The potential for autonomy was there, but the economic and social realities of daily life made it very difficult to access. The average woman's life was not defined by court cases and property disputes. It was defined by the ache in her back from the grinding stone, the weight of the water pot on her head, the fear and pain of childbirth, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of ensuring there was enough bread to feed her family for one more day. Her legal rights were a distant, theoretical comfort in a life that was overwhelmingly immediate, physical, and harsh. The laws were written on papyrus, but her reality was written on her own body, in the calluses on her hands and the wear on her bones. Religion permeated every aspect of ancient Egyptian life, and a woman's spiritual world was rich and complex, operating on two distinct but interconnected levels: the personal, domestic sphere, and the formal, public sphere of the great temples. For the average woman, the most immediate and important religious practices took place within her own home. The grand state gods worshipped in the massive temple complexes. Amun-Ra, Pa, Thoth were often distant figures, deities of the pharaoh and the state. Her daily spiritual life was more concerned with the household gods, the local deities, and the spirits who had a direct impact on the well-being of her family. Chief among these, as we've touched on, were the protectors of the home and family. The god Bez was a particular favorite. He was a dwarf god, a strange, bandy-legged figure with a lion's mane and a fearsome, almost comical face, often shown sticking out his tongue. He was a god of music, merriment, and dance, but his primary role was as a fierce protector of the household, especially of women and children. He fought off evil spirits, snakes, and all manner of dark forces. Images of Bez were everywhere in the home, carved into bed frames and headrests, painted on walls, and worn as amulets. He was a friendly, approachable, and deeply reassuring presence. Alongside him was his companion, Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Her fearsome appearance was believed to frighten away any malevolent spirits that might threaten a mother or her baby during the perilous time of delivery. A woman in labor might hold an amulet of Taweret in her hand, whispering prayers to her for a safe passage. These were not gods you worshipped from afar. They were part of the family, intimate and ever-present. A woman would make small daily offerings to these household deities, perhaps a bit of bread, a splash of beer, or a simple prayer spoken at a small household shrine. This was her domain. She was the primary officiant of the family's spiritual health, the guardian of its sacred center. Her piety was not about grand theological concepts. It was about the practical application of belief to protect her loved ones from harm. Beyond the household gods, women also participated in the vibrant festival life of their villages and towns. These festivals were a vital part of the social and religious calendar, a time to break the monotony of daily labor, to feast, drink beer, and worship the local gods. There were festivals for the harvest, for the coming of the flood, and for local patron deities. Women would have played a central role in these celebrations, preparing the special foods and drinks, participating in the singing and dancing, and joining the processions that wound their way through the village streets to the local shrine. It was a time of communal joy and release, a temporary suspension of the harsh realities of life. However, when we look at the great state temples, the world of formal religion, the picture becomes more male-dominated. The temple hierarchies were almost exclusively male. The high priests, the lector priests, who read the sacred texts, the scribes, who managed the vast economic wealth of the temples. These were all men. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was a powerful economic and political institution, and like most positions of public power, it was controlled by men. Yet, women were not entirely excluded from this world. A select few, usually from elite families, could serve as priestesses. The most common role was that of a chantress, or singer, of a particular god, most often a goddess like Hathor or Isis. These women were not priests in the sense of performing the central rituals of the cult. which were reserved for men. Instead, their role was to provide the musical accompaniment to the temple rites. They would sing hymns, play the sistrum, a sacred rattle associated with Hathor, and perform ritual dances. It was a position of considerable prestige. To be a chantress of Amun meant you were part of the religious life of the most powerful temple in Egypt. It conferred high social status and likely came with some economic benefits. These roles were often part-time. A woman could be a chantress and also be a wife and mother. It was a title she might hold for a period of her life, a way for her and her family to demonstrate their piety and their connection to the powerful temple establishment. For a very small number of elite women, an even higher title was available, the god's wife of Amun. During the New Kingdom, this became an incredibly powerful position, especially at the great temple of Amun-Ra at Thebes. The god's wife was a woman of royal blood, often the pharaoh's daughter, who was ritually married to the god Amun. She was not expected to be celibate. She could and did marry and have children, but in her role as the god's divine consort, she wielded immense religious authority and controlled vast estates and wealth in the name of the temple. She was one of the most powerful individuals in the land, a woman operating at the very highest levels of state power. But for every one god's wife of Amun, there were millions of ordinary women whose religious lives were far more grounded. For Merit, kneeling before her grinding stone, the complex theology of the Theban priests would have been a world away. Her prayers were more direct, more personal. She might whisper a plea to Renenutit, the cobra goddess of the harvest, to ensure the grain storage was full. She would murmur a charm to protect her children from the evil eye. And when a family member died, she would play a crucial role in the mourning process. Women were the primary mourners. It was their job to express the grief of the family, to perform the rituals of sorrow. Professional mourners, as mentioned, could be hired to heighten the display, wailing, tearing their clothes, and throwing dust on their heads. This wasn't just theatricality. It was a necessary part of the funerary process, a way of honoring the dead and beginning their journey to the afterlife. In her beliefs about the afterlife, a woman was seen as largely equal to a man. She too could hope to pass the judgment of Osiris and live on in the field of reeds, a vision of paradise that looked remarkably like a perfect, idealized version of Egypt, with no hard labor, no sickness, and no sorrow. But her place in that paradise was often described in relation to her husband. She would join him in the afterlife. The spells in the Book of the Dead were for the Osiris, man's name, and sometimes his wife, the lady of the house, woman's name. Her eternal destiny was linked to his. This duality is central to the female experience in ancient Egypt. A woman could be a powerful priestess, yet the highest rungs of the priesthood were barred to her. She was central to the spiritual life of the home, but her role in the state religion was supportive rather than primary. She had her own path to the afterlife, yet it was often framed by her husband's. Her spiritual world was a rich tapestry of personal devotion, communal celebration, and limited but prestigious public roles, all woven together against the backdrop of a fundamentally patriarchal religious system. The physical environment of ancient Egypt was a land of stark and beautiful contrasts, and this environment shaped every facet of a woman's life, often in brutal ways. The entire civilization was a thin, green ribbon of life clinging precariously to the banks of the Nile, flanked on both sides by the vast, hostile emptiness of the desert. This duality of the black land, the fertile soil, and the red land, the desert, was fundamental to the Egyptian worldview, and for a woman living out her days there, it was a tangible, daily reality. The most dominant feature of the climate was, of course, the sun. It was not the gentle, benevolent sun of more temperate climates. It was a relentless, punishing force for much of the year. The heat could be staggering, regularly soaring well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius, in the summer months. For a woman whose work was largely performed outdoors or in poorly ventilated homes, there was little escape. Imagine our character, Merit, making her midday trip to the river for water. The sun beats down on her head, the air is thick and heavy, and the baked earth radiates heat back up at her. The glare off the water is blinding. Sweat streams down her face, attracting the ubiquitous flies that swarm everywhere. These weren't just an annoyance. They were carriers of disease, crawling on food, on faces, and on the eyes of sleeping children. The simple act of working in a small vegetable plot, weeding and watering under that oppressive sun, would be utterly draining. The mudbrick homes offered some respite, their thick walls designed to absorb the heat of the day and release it slowly during the cool of the night. But they were also dark and often stuffy. The small, high windows that kept out the direct sun also prevented much air circulation. The home could become a kind of oven during the hottest part of the day, and the sun was not just a source of discomfort. It was a danger. Sunburn, heat exhaustion, and sunstroke were constant risks for people who spent their lives working under its gaze. The Egyptians were keenly aware of this, and it influenced their appearance. The famous black coal they wore around their eyes was not just for cosmetic reasons. They believed it had magical healing properties, but it also served a very practical purpose. It reduced the glare of the sun, much like the black grease athletes wear under their eyes today. It was a small but essential adaptation to a harsh environment. Then there was the dust and sand. Egypt is a desert country, and the wind, the Khamsin, could whip up blinding dust storms that would sweep across the landscape, reducing visibility to near zero and filling the air with a choking grit. This fine sand got into everything. It settled as a thin layer on every surface in the home. It got into the food, as we've seen, grinding down teeth over a lifetime. And it got into people's eyes. Eye infections were rampant in ancient Egypt. The combination of sand, dust, and flies created the perfect conditions for diseases like trachoma, a bacterial infection that, if left untreated, leads to scarring of the inner eyelid. This scarring causes the eyelashes to turn inward, scratching the cornea with every blink. It's an agonizingly painful condition that eventually leads to blindness. Many skeletal remains show evidence of this, and texts describe treatments for a variety of eye ailments. It's likely that many older Egyptians, women and men alike, lived with chronic eye pain and failing vision, a direct result of the environment they inhabited. The Nile itself, the source of all life, was a double-edged sword. Its predictable annual flood, the inundation, was a miracle of nature that deposited a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt onto the farmland, making agriculture possible. The Egyptians celebrated its arrival, but the flood could also be unpredictable. If the flood was too low, the land would not be sufficiently fertilized or watered, leading to poor harvests and the threat of famine. If the flood was too high, it could be catastrophic, washing away homes, destroying dikes and canals, and drowning livestock. A woman living in a low-lying village would live with the annual anxiety of the flood. Would it be a good Nile that brought abundance? Or would it be a disaster that threatened her family's very survival? During a famine, a woman's burden would become almost unbearable. As the person responsible for feeding the family, she would be the one to ration the dwindling food supplies, to watch her children grow thin and weak. Historical records, like the admonitions of Epure, describe the horrors of social breakdown during periods of famine and chaos, painting grim pictures of desperation and starvation. In these times of crisis, women and children were always the most vulnerable. The very material of their homes was a product of the environment. Mudbrick, made from Nile mud, mixed with straw, and baked in the sun, was the universal building material. It was cheap, abundant, and a good insulator, but it was also vulnerable. Heavy rains, though rare, could dissolve the bricks. The annual flood could undermine the foundations, and the bricks were a haven for pests, scorpions, snakes, and insects could easily make their homes in the cracks and crevices of the walls. A woman would have to be constantly vigilant, checking bedding for scorpions before putting a child to sleep, being wary of where she put her hands and feet in the dark corners of her home. Even the act of keeping a home clean was a constant battle against the environment. The floor was packed earth. The wind blew in dust. The cooking fire produced soot. Chickens or a goat might wander in and out of the main living space. Maintaining a basic level of hygiene would have been an endless and often losing struggle. So, when we picture the life of an ancient Egyptian woman, we must not envision her against a backdrop of serene palm trees and majestic pyramids alone. We must also see her squinting against the harsh sun, waving away persistent flies, feeling the grit of sand between her teeth. and living with the low-level anxiety that came from being so utterly dependent on the whims of a powerful and often unforgiving natural world. Her life was a constant negotiation with the heat, the dust, and the river. She was a product of this environment, her body shaped by its demands, and her spirit forged in its crucible. Her resilience was a testament to her ability to endure and adapt to a land that was both a nurturing mother and a harsh, brutal master. The clothing and personal appearance of women in ancient Egypt are some of the most iconic and recognizable aspects of the civilization. Yet they tell a story that is, like everything else, one of practicality, social status, and adaptation to a harsh climate. The simple, elegant lines of the dresses we see in tomb paintings and statues project an image of effortless grace. But the reality behind maintaining that appearance was, once again, a matter of considerable labor. The primary textile was linen, made from the flax plant. Cotton was not widely used in Egypt until much later, during the Roman period. Linen was the perfect fabric for the hot climate. It is lightweight, breathable, and wicks moisture away from the skin. The quality of the linen could vary dramatically, from a coarse, rough weave for the working class to a diaphanous, almost transparently fine gauze for the elite. For a woman like Merit, her dress would have been made from a durable, undyed, off-white linen. It would likely have been a simple, functional garment, a rectangular piece of cloth sewn into a tube, held up by two straps that went over the shoulders. This sheath-like dress was practical. It allowed for freedom of movement for the endless tasks of bending, kneeling, and carrying. It was also easy to clean, a crucial consideration in a dusty environment where laundry was a significant chore. Washing clothes meant another trip to the Nile, beating the garments against a smooth stone, and laying them out on bushes to dry and bleach in the powerful sun. For a wealthy woman, the style of dress might be more elaborate. She might wear a pleated gown, a delicate art that required pressing the damp linen into a grooved board to set the pleats. These pleats would fall out after washing, so maintaining such a garment was a sign of immense leisure and wealth. It meant you had servants who could spend hours repleating your dress after every wear. Wealthy women also had access to dyed linens, though the color palette was generally limited to earthy tones like red and yellow ochre, with blue and green being more expensive and rare. Beneath their clothes, most people, men and women, rich and poor, wore nothing. Undergarments were not a feature of ancient Egyptian dress. This was a practical choice in the heat, but it also speaks to a different cultural attitude towards the body. The Egyptians were generally less modest in our modern sense. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom sometimes show elite women at banquets wearing dresses of such fine, transparent linen that their bodies are clearly visible underneath. This was not seen as scandalous, but as a display of beauty and status. One of the most striking aspects of Egyptian appearance was their approach to hair. For reasons of both hygiene and style, many Egyptians, especially among the elite, shaved their heads completely. A full head of natural hair was hot, difficult to keep clean, and a prime breeding ground for lice, a persistent problem in the ancient world. A shaved head was cool, clean, and practical, but this did not mean they went about bald. Instead, they wore elaborate wigs, which became a primary indicator of social standing. These wigs were made from human hair, sometimes supplemented with vegetable fibers or horsehair. They were complex constructions, intricately braided, curled, and often adorned with beads, ribbons, or jeweled ornaments. A wealthy woman might own several wigs for different occasions, a heavy one for formal events, and a lighter, simpler one for daily wear. These wigs were expensive to make and required careful maintenance. They were a clear and immediate signal of a person's wealth and status. For Merit and her family, a shaved head was likely a matter of pure practicality, to avoid lice. She probably did not own a wig. She might have covered her shaved head with a simple linen cloth or scarf to protect it from the sun while working outside. Or she might have kept her natural hair short and manageable. The elaborate hairstyles we see in art belonged to a world she could only glimpse from a distance. And then there was the makeup. Both men and women in ancient Egypt were famous for their use of cosmetics, particularly eye paint. As we've noted, the black coal they used was made from ground galena, a lead sulfide mineral. They would mix this powder with a little oil or water to make a paste, and then apply it with a small stick, drawing a thick, almond-shaped line around the eyes, often extending out towards the temples. This had the practical benefit of reducing sun glare, and they also believed it had magical protective qualities. warding off eye infections and the evil eye. In addition to black coal, they also used a green eye paint made from ground malachite, a copper ore. This was often applied to the upper eyelid or the brow bone. Again, this was believed to have magical properties, linked to the goddess Hathor and the concept of new life and fertility. Cosmetics were not seen as frivolous. They were an essential part of daily grooming, health, and religious belief. A woman would have her own small set of cosmetic tools, a palette for grinding the minerals, a small pot for holding the coal, and an applicator stick. These items are found in graves across all social strata, from the humble to the magnificent. Even a poor woman would have possessed a simple version of this cosmetic kit. Her coal pot might be a simple piece of pottery rather than carved alabaster, but the ritual of applying the eye paint was a shared cultural practice. They also used a red ochre paste as a form of blush or lipstick, applying it to the cheeks and lips to give a healthy, youthful glow. And they were very fond of perfumes and scented oils. In a hot climate where bathing could be infrequent, scented oils made from flowers like lotus or lily, or resins like myrrh and frankincense, were used to anoint the body, moisturize the skin, and act as a deodorant. At lavish banquets, wealthy guests might be given a cone of scented fat to place on top of their wigs. As the evening progressed, the heat of their body would slowly melt the cone, releasing the perfume and sending fragrant oil trickling down over their wig and shoulders. It's an image that is both luxurious and, to our modern sensibilities, a little strange. So, the appearance of an ancient Egyptian woman was a complex statement. Her simple linen dress spoke of the need for practicality in a hot climate. Her shaved head spoke of the need for hygiene in a world without modern sanitation. Her wig, if she had one, spoke of her status, and her kohl-rimmed eyes spoke of a deep-seated belief in the intersection of beauty, health, and magic. For the vast majority of women, life was too consumed with labor to allow for the elaborate grooming of the elite. Their beauty was of a different kind, the beauty of strength, of resilience, etched into the lines of their faces by the sun and the wind, and reflected in the steady, enduring gaze that met the challenges of each new day. The specter of violence and vulnerability was a constant, low-humming undercurrent in the life of an ancient Egyptian woman. While the formal legal system offered her protections on paper, the realities of a patriarchal society and the harshness of the environment often left her exposed to dangers both inside and outside the home. The most intimate of these threats was domestic violence. It is a difficult subject to find in the official record. Grand inscriptions on temple walls and formal legal papyri do not speak of such things. Our evidence is more subtle, gleaned from private letters, wisdom texts, and the silent testimony of human remains. The wisdom texts, collections of advice passed down from a father to his son, often counsel against mistreating one's wife. One famous passage advises, "Do not control your wife in her house. When you know she is efficient, do not say to her, 'Where is it? Get it,' when she has put it in the right place. Let your eye observe in silence. Then you recognize her skill." This advice is telling. The fact that a father felt the need to explicitly tell his son not to be a household tyrant suggests that such behavior was common enough to warrant a warning against it. Another text warns a man not to mistreat his wife, because she will appeal to the gods who will hear her cries. This implies both that women were being mistreated and that their only recourse might have been a spiritual one. While physical abuse is not explicitly detailed in these texts, the theme of controlling, berating, and emotionally mistreating a wife is present. Physical violence was almost certainly a part of this dynamic. In a society where men held the ultimate authority in the household, and where life was often frustrating and difficult, it is naive to assume that women were safe from their husband's anger. A man who was struggling to provide for his family, who was exhausted from his own labor in the fields, or who had drunk too much beer at a festival, could easily turn his frustrations on the person closest to him. And a woman's options for escape were, as we've seen, severely limited. She could appeal to her male relatives, her father or brothers, to intervene on her behalf. This might offer some protection, as a man would not want to anger his wife's family. But if she was far from her own kin, or if they were unwilling or unable to help, she would be largely on her own. Divorce was a legal option, but a terrifying economic prospect. The fear of poverty and social isolation would have kept many women trapped in abusive situations. Beyond the home, women were vulnerable in other ways. During times of social upheaval, famine, civil war, or foreign invasion, the normal structures of society would break down, and women and children always suffered the most. Historical accounts of such periods, though often propagandistic, speak of chaos in the land, the tale of the eloquent peasant, while a work of fiction paints a picture of a countryside where a poor man can be easily robbed and abused by a corrupt official. In such a world, a woman traveling alone would have been at even greater risk. Egyptian art itself gives us grim evidence of the fate of women during warfare. Temple reliefs, celebrating military victories, often depict the pharaoh smiting his enemies, while his soldiers lead away long lines of captured people. Among these captives, women and children are prominent. They are shown being herded along, their arms bound, their children clinging to them. These women were spoils of war. Their husbands and fathers had been killed, their homes destroyed, and they were now being taken back to Egypt to become slaves or servants in the households of their conquerors. They faced a future of utter powerlessness, subject to the whims of their new masters. This was the fate that awaited the women of Nubia, of Libya, and of the Levant when the Egyptian army was on the march. And it was a fate that Egyptian women themselves would have feared if their own land was ever successfully invaded. There was also a structural vulnerability inherent in their dependence on men for so many things. While a woman could own property, the primary economic activity of agriculture was male-dominated. A widow who inherited a plot of land would have to hire men to work it for her or rely on her sons. If she had no sons, she would be in a precarious position. The story of Nanakte, the woman who disinherited some of her children, is powerful, but it also reveals her dependence. She rewarded the children who had cared for her and punished those who had not. This shows that in her old age, she was reliant on her children for her daily survival. An old woman without dutiful children to support her would face a grim and impoverished end. This vulnerability extended to the legal system itself. Although a woman could bring a case to court, she was entering a world run entirely by men. The judges were men. The scribes were men. The social norms and unwritten rules were shaped by a male perspective. We have records of cases where women seem to have received fair treatment, but it's impossible to know how many women were intimidated out of seeking justice, or whose testimony was given less weight simply because she was a woman. We must imagine the courage it would take for a village woman who had spent her life in the domestic sphere to stand before a panel of powerful local officials and accuse a man of wronging her. It would have been an intimidating and deeply unequal encounter. The life of a woman was lived within these nested layers of vulnerability. The intimate threat of a husband's anger, the social chaos of a bad harvest, the existential terror of war, and the quiet structural dependence on the men around her. Her strength was not in being immune to these dangers, but in navigating them every day. She learned to be resilient, to be diplomatic within her own home, to build strong bonds with other women in her community for mutual support, and to place her faith in the protective power of her household gods. She lived in a world that offered her certain rights but little true security, a world where her well-being often depended less on the law and more on the character of the men in her life and the fickle fortunes of the land itself. The progression of a woman's life in ancient Egypt was a journey through clearly defined and often very difficult stages. From a girlhood spent in preparation for a life of domestic labor, she would transition, often abruptly, into the roles of wife and mother. But what happened after her children were grown? What was the life of an older woman like? If a woman survived the immense dangers of her childbearing years, the multiple pregnancies, the perilous deliveries, and if she managed to avoid the myriad diseases and accidents of daily life, she could hope to reach the status of a respected elder. Old age was not seen as a period of uselessness, but as a time of wisdom and authority within the family. An older woman, a grandmother, would become the matriarch of the household. Her title, mistress of the house, would now carry the full weight of her years of experience. She would have overseen the running of a household for decades. She knew how to manage food stores, how to treat common childhood ailments with traditional remedies, how to negotiate with merchants in the market, and how to maintain peace in a crowded, multi-generational home. Her sons' wives, the new young women brought into the family, would be expected to defer to her authority and learn from her. She would become the repository of the family's history and traditions, the living link to its past. This position of respect, however, was entirely contingent on having surviving children to care for her. As we've seen with the story of Naunachte, the social contract was clear. Children were expected to support their elderly parents. This was their most important duty. An older woman who had dutiful sons and daughters-in-law to provide for her could enjoy a relatively comfortable and secure old age, free from the backbreaking labor of her youth. She would spend her days watching over her grandchildren, offering advice, and managing the household from a position of respected authority. But for a woman who outlived her children, or whose children were unable or unwilling to support her, old age would be a time of extreme poverty and hardship. Without a social safety net or state-sponsored pensions, she would be reliant on the charity of her community or extended family. It was a precarious existence. The final stage of any Egyptian's life was the preparation for death and the afterlife. The Egyptians had a profound and elaborate set of beliefs about what came after death, and preparing for a successful journey into the next world was a central preoccupation throughout their lives. For women, access to this eternal paradise, the field of reeds, was just as possible as it was for men, but their preparations were often tied to those of their husbands. In an ideal scenario, a husband and wife would be buried together in a shared tomb. The tomb would be prepared and decorated during their lifetimes, if they had the means. The decoration would depict them together, enjoying the idealized pleasures of the afterlife, feasting, hunting in the marshes, and overseeing their celestial estates. The woman is almost always shown as a youthful, beautiful figure at the peak of her health and fertility, even if she died in old age. The afterlife was a place where the ravages of time and labor were erased. To equip them for this journey, they would be buried with grave goods. For a woman, this might include her jewelry, her cosmetic palettes, a mirror, and containers of scented oils. It might also include shabti figures, small magical figurines that were supposed to come to life in the afterlife and perform any manual labor required of the deceased. This is a telling detail. Even in paradise, there was a recognition that work needed to be done and a desire to avoid it. A wealthy woman might have hundreds of shabtis buried with her, one for every day of the year, plus overseers. A poor woman might have only one or two, or none at all. The process of mummification was also available to women, though the quality and expense of the procedure varied enormously. A queen would receive the most elaborate and sophisticated mummification possible. A woman from a wealthy family might have a well-executed mummification, her body carefully preserved and wrapped in fine linen bandages with amulets tucked into the layers. For a woman like Merit, the preservation of her body would have been much simpler. She might be naturally desiccated by the hot desert sand in a simple pit grave, or receive a rudimentary form of mummification her family could afford. The goal was the same, to preserve the physical body so that her spirit, her Ka and Ba, would have a home to return to. The ultimate hope was to pass the final judgment, the weighing of the heart. In this ceremony, the deceased person's heart was weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by a terrifying beast called Ammit, and the soul would cease to exist. If the heart was as light as the feather, the deceased would be declared true of voice and granted entry into the eternal paradise. Women underwent this judgment, just as men did. The spells in the Book of the Dead, a collection of magical texts intended to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the underworld, could be purchased and used by women. They would have their own name inserted into the spells. The Osiris, the Lady of the House, Merit, true of voice. However, the reality of death often fell short of this idealized vision. Life expectancy was low. A woman was more likely to die young, in childbirth, than to live to a respected old age. If her husband died first, she would become a widow. While a widow had legal rights and could inherit property, her social position was often difficult. She was a woman without a male protector, and she might face pressure from her husband's family over the inheritance. Her best hope for security was to have a grown son who could take over as the head of the household. So, as we look back at the full arc of a woman's life, we see a relentless series of challenges. A childhood cut short, a marriage based on practicality, a life defined by grueling physical labor, the constant, life-threatening danger of childbirth, the sorrow of high infant mortality, the vulnerability to violence and famine, and an old age whose comfort was entirely dependent on the survival and goodwill of her children. And yet, through it all, there was an incredible resilience. These women were not passive victims of their circumstances. They were active agents in their own lives, within the strict confines of their world. They managed complex households, participated in the economy, maintained the spiritual health of their families, and navigated a dangerous world with skill and courage. They found joy in their children, in festivals, in the camaraderie of other women. They created beauty in their textiles and their personal adornment. They held a legal standing that was, in theory, ahead of its time. The story of women in ancient Egypt is not a simple one. It's a story of a brutal reality shot through with surprising moments of agency and power. It's a story of bodies broken by labor and of spirits that endured. It's the story of merit and millions like her, whose silent, tireless work formed the true living foundation upon which the grand civilization of the pharaohs was built. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can picture her, not as a stylized figure on a tomb wall, but as a real person. At the end of a long day, the children are finally asleep. The last of the embers are glowing in the hearth. The house is quiet. She sits for a moment. The cool night air, a balm on her tired skin. Her body aches, but she is here. She has survived another day. And in the morning, she will rise before the sun and begin again. Let's return for a moment to that saddle quern, the simple stone tool that dominated so much of a woman's time and energy. It's easy for us to hear the term grinding grain and imagine something rustic, perhaps even quaint. But it's crucial to understand the sheer physical toll of this process. The design of the saddle quern was inefficient and ergonomically disastrous. Kneeling or squatting for hours, a woman had to push a smaller stone back and forth across a larger one, using the force of her upper body and back. It was a repetitive, high-impact motion. Bioarchaeologists studying female skeletal remains from ancient Egypt have created a veritable catalog of occupational injuries. They find osteoarthritis in the knees and ankles from the constant pressure of kneeling. They find degenerative joint disease in the lower back, a direct result of the unnatural posture and the force exerted. The vertebrae in the spine often show signs of compression and strain. They even find specific stress fractures in the toes, caused by pushing off the ground for leverage during the grinding motion. Her skeleton becomes a diary, written in bone, recording the thousands of hours she spent in this single, arduous task. This wasn't a choice. It was a non-negotiable part of survival. Bread was not something you bought at a market for a few coins. Bread was something you created from scratch, every single day, through sheer force of will and physical effort. The flour produced was coarse and, as we've noted, full of grit. This led to a lifetime of dental problems. Imagine the chronic, low-level pain of a toothache, for which there was no effective remedy. They had some dental knowledge. They could drain abscesses, and sometimes even created rudimentary bridges. But for the average person, a bad tooth was something to be endured, a constant companion of pain that could flare up at any moment. This relentless labor started in girlhood. A young girl would begin with a smaller quern, learning the motion, building the muscles. By the time she was a teenager, she would have graduated to the full-size version, and this work would be her daily reality until she was too old or infirm to continue, at which point, hopefully, a daughter or daughter-in-law would take her place. This single task is a powerful lens through which to view the lives of most women in ancient Egypt. It was work that was essential, yet invisible, in the grand narrative of kings and battles. It was unpaid, performed within the confines of the home, and it physically marked the bodies of the women who performed it. It's a stark reminder that the great monuments and golden treasures of the pharaohs were all built on a foundation of this kind of mundane, backbreaking labor. The pyramids are a testament to organized manpower, but the daily loaf of bread is a testament to the endurance of women. Now, let's expand our view from the single home to the community. While much of a woman's work was isolating, performed alone or with her immediate family, there were crucial points of social connection. The daily trip to the river or the village well was one such point. This was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the office water cooler. Here, in the process of fetching the day's water supply, women would exchange information, reinforce social bonds, and create a powerful female network. They would share news, offer advice on sick children, arrange for the borrowing of a tool, or simply complain about their husbands or mothers-in-law. This was not idle gossip. It was a vital social lubricant and a support system. In a world with no mass media, this oral network was how news traveled. It was how reputations were made and broken. It was how community standards were enforced. A woman who was seen as lazy or a poor mother would be the subject of talk at the well. A woman known for her kindness or her skill in healing would earn the respect of her peers. This community of women provided a crucial counterbalance to the patriarchal structure of the individual household. Within her home, a woman was subordinate to her husband. But at the riverbank, among her peers, she was part of a collective. This collective could be a source of immense comfort and solidarity. When a woman was in labor, it was this network that would swing into action, with neighbors and relatives coming to assist. When a family suffered a death, it was the women of the community who would come to mourn and to bring food. But this network could also be a source of pressure and judgment. A woman's behavior would be closely scrutinized by her peers. There was little privacy in a small Egyptian village. Everyone knew everyone else's business. This constant social surveillance could be stifling, enforcing conformity and punishing those who stepped outside of accepted norms. Another crucial venue for social life was the local market. Here, a woman might go to trade her small surplus, a few vegetables, a length of linen, a pot of beer, for something her family needed. The market would have been a vibrant, noisy, and colorful place. People from the surrounding area would gather, shouting their wares, haggling over prices, and catching up on news. It was a chaotic and exciting break from the routine of the home. Here, a woman could exercise her economic agency, however limited. Her skill in negotiation could directly impact her family's well-being, earning them a little extra food or a small luxury. These moments of connection, at the river, at the market, during a festival, were the bright threads in the fabric of a life that was often dominated by the drab colors of monotonous labor. They were the spaces where a woman could be more than just a wife, a mother, or a laborer. She could be a friend, a neighbor, a skilled negotiator, a respected member of her community. These social bonds were her primary source of support, her defense against the isolation of the home and the hardships of her daily life. They were as essential to her survival as the bread she baked and the water she carried. Let's delve deeper into the health challenges that shadowed a woman's life. We've touched upon the dangers of childbirth, the dental attrition from gritty food, and the chronic infections from parasites and flies. But the list of afflictions was long, and the means of treating them were a fascinating and often ineffective blend of practical observation and magical thinking. The Egyptian medical system was one of the most advanced of its time. Medical papyri, like the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, list hundreds of ailments and their prescribed treatments. They had a sophisticated understanding of anatomy, likely gained through the practice of mummification. They could identify different types of injuries, set broken bones with splints, and even perform simple surgery. They recognized that diseases had internal causes and weren't just the result of divine anger, but their knowledge was still profoundly limited. They had no concept of germ theory. An infection was understood as a poison or a hostile presence entering the body, not as the work of microscopic organisms. This meant that while they could stitch a wound, they had no way to prevent it from becoming infected. A simple cut could easily lead to sepsis and death. For women, gynecological problems were a major source of suffering. The medical texts list remedies for everything from menstrual irregularities to uterine prolapse, a common and debilitating condition for women who had endured multiple difficult births. The treatments, however, were often bizarre by our standards. They might involve fumigating the afflicted area with incense, or inserting mixtures of honey, crocodile dung, or sour milk into the vagina. While some of these ingredients might have had mild antiseptic properties, honey for instance, others were actively harmful, introducing dangerous bacteria into the body. Honey was a common ingredient in many remedies. It has natural antibacterial properties and was used in wound dressings. This is an example of a practical, effective treatment based on observation. But for every one of these, there were 10 others based purely on magical thinking or flawed logic. For example, a treatment for a migraine might involve rubbing a fried fish on the afflicted side of the head. The line between doctor and magician was blurry, if it existed at all. A physician, or sun-w, pronounced su, nu, would use both practical remedies and magical incantations. When treating a patient, a doctor would often recite a spell to magically empower the medicine or to banish the demon believed to be causing the illness. For the patient, there was no distinction. The spell was as much a part of the cure as the herbal poultice. Amulets were a crucial part of preventative medicine. A woman would wear amulets to protect herself and her children from sickness. The ankh, the symbol of life, was a popular choice. The Eye of Horus, or Wedjat Eye, was a powerful symbol of healing and protection. And of course, the figures of Bez and Taweret were essential for safeguarding the family. These weren't just jewelry, they were a form of spiritual armor, a first line of defense against a world filled with invisible dangers. Consider the psychological burden of living in such a world. Every illness, every ache and pain could be interpreted as a sign of divine disfavor or a magical attack from an enemy. A woman whose child fell sick would not only have to deal with the practicalities of caring for them, but also the gnawing fear that she had somehow failed to protect them, that she had offended a god, or that a neighbor had cast a curse upon her household. This anxiety would have been pervasive. The average life expectancy at birth was low, perhaps around 30 to 35 years. This number is skewed by the incredibly high rates of infant and child mortality. If a person survived to adulthood, they had a decent chance of living into their 40s or 50s. But childhood was a minefield. Common childhood diseases, for which we now have vaccines, measles, smallpox, would have been devastating. Diarrheal diseases, caused by contaminated food and water, were a major killer of infants and young children. A mother would have lived with the constant, terrifying reality that her children were fragile and that death could snatch them away at any moment. This reality shaped the emotional landscape of the family. While parents undoubtedly loved their children deeply, they may have also maintained a certain emotional distance, a defense mechanism against the almost inevitable pain of loss. The desire for many children was, in part, a tragic form of insurance. If you had 8 children, perhaps 3 or 4 might survive to carry on the family line. This constant proximity to death also shaped their view of life. It was not something to be taken for granted. It was precious, and the enjoyment of its simple pleasures, a good meal, a festival, the laughter of a child, was all the more poignant because of its fragility. For a woman, her own body was a source of both immense power, the ability to create life, and profound vulnerability. The monthly cycle of menstruation, the long months of pregnancy, the agony and danger of childbirth, the physical demands of nursing. Her life was dictated by her biology in a very direct and often brutal way. She had little control over her own fertility. There were some contraceptive recipes mentioned in the papyri, often involving crocodile dung or acacia gum, which actually has some spermicidal properties, but their effectiveness would have been minimal at best. A woman's reproductive life was a relentless cycle of pregnancy and birth, a biological imperative that defined her existence and carried with it the constant risk of death. Her health was not a private matter. It was a resource that belonged to her family, a vessel for the continuation of the lineage. Let us contrast the lives of 2 hypothetical women to better understand the vast chasm of experience that separated the rich and the poor. First, let's return to Merit, our village woman. She wakes before dawn on a hard reed mat. Her first act is to spend hours at the saddle quern, her body already aching with the familiar strain of the work. The flour she makes is coarse, and the bread she bakes from it will be gritty. She walks a long distance to the Nile, her shoulders and neck burning from the weight of the heavy water pot. She spends her day in an endless cycle of chores, tending a small, dusty garden, cleaning, mending rough linen clothes, and watching her children, all while battling the heat and the flies. Her home is a 1 or 2 room mudbrick structure, crowded and dark. Her diet is monotonous, consisting mainly of bread, beer, onions, and perhaps some fish. Meat is a rare luxury, reserved for a festival day. She has 1 or 2 simple linen dresses to her name, Her jewelry is a string of clay beads and a worn amulet of taweret. Her greatest fear is a failed harvest, which would mean starvation for her family. Her greatest hope is that her children survive to adulthood and that one of her sons will care for her in her old age. Her world is small, bounded by her village and the rhythms of the agricultural season. Her life is one of physical exhaustion and constant, low-level anxiety. Now, let's imagine a different woman. Let's call her Nebet. Nebet is the wife of a high-ranking official in Thebes, perhaps a vizier or a general. She also wakes at dawn, but she does so in a spacious villa, on a comfortable bed with a wooden frame and a soft mattress. She does not go to the grinding stone. That work is done by servants in a separate part of the house. The flour they produce is of the finest quality, ground and sieved multiple times to remove any grit. The bread she eats is light and soft, perhaps sweetened with honey and dates. She does not walk to the Nile for water. Servants do that for her. The water she uses for bathing is brought to her, perhaps already warmed. Her morning is a leisurely affair. She is attended by her handmaidens, who help her bathe and groom. They anoint her skin with fragrant oils. They help her choose her attire for the day, from a large wooden chest filled with garments of the finest, most gossamer thin linen, many of them exquisitely pleated or dyed in vibrant colors. They help her put on her elaborate wig, a masterpiece of human hair, and apply her makeup from a cosmetic kit made of alabaster, ivory, and gold. Her day is not filled with labor, but with supervision and leisure. She will manage her large household, giving instructions to her staff of servants who handle the cooking, cleaning, and childcare. She might spend time weaving on a personal loom, not out of necessity, but as a genteel pastime. She might receive visitors, other women of her elite class, and they will sit in a shaded garden courtyard, sipping wine and exchanging court gossip. Her diet is rich and varied. She eats beef, roasted duck, and a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. She drinks fine wine from imported amphorae. In the afternoon, she might accompany her husband to a temple ceremony or a banquet at the home of another noble. At these events, she is a vision of elegance and wealth, her body adorned with intricate jewelry of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. Her world is large and cosmopolitan. She is aware of the politics of the court, of trade with foreign lands, of the grand building projects of the pharaoh. Her fears are not of starvation, but of a fall from political favor for her husband, which could mean the loss of their wealth and status. Her hopes are for a strategic marriage for her daughter, or a high-ranking appointment for her son. The fundamental, biological experiences of being a woman, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, are the same for both Merit and Nebet, but Nebet's experience of them is vastly different. When she goes into labor, she will be attended by the best physicians and midwives. While the risks are still real, her chances of survival are significantly higher. If her child gets sick, she has access to trained doctors and expensive remedies. While she will still grieve a loss, she is less likely to experience the repeated, devastating losses that Merit endures. Even their paths to the afterlife are different. Nebet and her husband will have a large, beautifully decorated tomb carved for them in the Theban necropolis, filled with high-quality grave goods to ensure a comfortable existence for all eternity. Merit will be lucky to have a simple pit grave and a few pottery vessels to accompany her. The legal rights they hold are identical. Both Merit and Nebet have the right to own property, to go to court, to initiate a divorce. But for Nebet, these rights are a tangible reality. She has significant personal wealth, the education, or at least the literacy of a scribe in her employ, to understand complex contracts and the social standing to ensure her voice is heard. For Merit, these same rights are a distant, theoretical promise, largely irrelevant to the pressing daily struggle for survival. This vast gulf between their lives highlights a crucial point. One cannot speak of the female experience in ancient Egypt. There were many experiences, dictated almost entirely by social class, while gender imposed a common set of challenges and expectations on all women. It was the accident of birth, whether one was born in a mudbrick hut or a noble's villa, that ultimately determined the brutality or the comfort of one's existence. The life of a woman was hard, But for the vast majority, for the millions of merits, it was unimaginably, relentlessly brutal. The very concept of childhood as we understand it, a protected period of play, learning, and emotional development, was a luxury that most in ancient Egypt could not afford. For a young girl, life was an apprenticeship for the arduous future that awaited her. Play was not entirely absent, of course. Archaeologists have found toys, simple wooden dolls, board games like Senet, balls made of leather or reeds. Children undoubtedly laughed and ran and played games in the dusty village streets. But this period of carefree existence was brief. From a very early age, a girl's play would have been integrated with her training. A game might involve shaping a small piece of dough alongside her mother, or carrying a small empty pot on her head in imitation of the older women. The message was clear. Your purpose is to learn these tasks. By the age of 5 or 6, she would be contributing to the household in meaningful ways. She would be tasked with watching her younger siblings, a significant responsibility in a world full of dangers like open fires, deep wells, and the nearby river with its hidden crocodiles. She would learn to shoo away birds from the drying grain or to fetch water in a small jug. Her education was not academic. Literacy was the domain of a specialized class of male scribes. While some elite women, particularly those of royal or noble birth, might learn to read and write, for the average girl, education was entirely practical and vocational. She learned by observing and doing. She learned the rhythms of the household, the names and uses of different herbs, the techniques of spinning and weaving, and the complex social rules of her community. She learned which neighbors could be trusted and which should be avoided. This was the knowledge that would ensure her survival. The transition from girlhood to womanhood was marked not by a specific age, but by the onset of puberty. Once a girl began to menstruate, she was considered marriageable. This typically happened between the ages of 12 and 14. Imagine a girl of 13, still with the physical and emotional immaturity of a child, being married to a young man she barely knows and moving to his family's home to begin her life as a wife. The psychological shock must have been immense. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, leaving the primary care of her mother, and entering a new household where she would be under the authority of her husband and, very often, her mother-in-law. Her performance in her new role would be under intense scrutiny. Could she grind grain efficiently? Was her bread well made? Was she respectful and obedient? And, most importantly, could she conceive a child? The pressure to become pregnant almost immediately would have been enormous. Her value as a wife was inextricably tied to her fertility. This early transition to marriage and motherhood had profound consequences for her physical health. A young teenage girl's body is not yet fully developed for childbirth. Her pelvis is narrower, making her more susceptible to obstructed labor, a life-threatening complication for both mother and child. The high rates of maternal mortality were undoubtedly exacerbated by the practice of early marriage. A woman who survived her first birth would then embark on a relentless cycle of pregnancy and lactation that would dominate her life for the next 2 decades. There was no space for personal development, for discovering one's own identity outside the prescribed roles of wife and mother. Her life was a path laid out for her from the moment she was born a girl. Her destiny was to labor, to bear children, and to serve her family. This is not to say that there was no love or affection in these relationships. A marriage arranged for practical reasons could certainly deepen into a bond of companionship and mutual respect over time. A mother's love for her children was fierce and powerful, but the framework of her life was one of duty and obligation, not personal choice. The art of ancient Egypt often depicts children with a strange mixture of realism and stylization. They are often shown as miniature adults, with the proportions of a child, but the posture and dress of their parents. They are also frequently depicted naked, with a single lock of hair on the side of their head, the side lock of youth, which would be cut off to mark the transition to adulthood. This artistic convention perhaps reflects the reality of their position in society. They were seen less as a distinct category of human beings, and more as adults, in training. For a girl, this training was intense, compressed, and unforgiving. Her childhood was a brief, fleeting moment before she was thrust into the full, brutal reality of a woman's life, a life for which she had been preparing since she was old enough to walk. The simple linen sheath dress, so iconic of ancient Egyptian women, represents a story of both practicality and immense labor. Linen is derived from the flax plant, and the process of turning this tough, fibrous plant into soft, wearable cloth was one of the most time-consuming tasks in a woman's repertoire. First, the flax had to be harvested, a job often done by men. Then, the real work for the women began. The plants were subjected to retting, a process of soaking them in water for an extended period to rot away the woody outer stem and loosen the valuable fibers within. This was often done in the stagnant, smelly waters of a canal or a pond. After retting, the flax was dried and then scotched, which meant beating the stalks with a wooden mallet to break away the last of the woody parts. This was followed by heckling, pulling the fibers through a series of combs with progressively finer teeth to separate the long, desirable fibers from the short, coarse ones and to align them for spinning. All of this was hard, dusty, and smelly work, performed before a single thread was even created. Then came the spinning. Using a simple drop spindle, a weighted stick, a woman would patiently twist the flax fibers into a continuous thread. This was a skill that required incredible dexterity and patience. The fineness and evenness of the thread would determine the quality of the final cloth. A skilled spinner could produce a thread that was incredibly fine and strong. This was a task that could be done almost anywhere, and women were often depicted with their spindles, spinning while supervising children or socializing. It was the ancient equivalent of knitting, a portable task that filled the in-between moments of the day. Finally, the thread was taken to the loom. In ancient Egypt, they used both horizontal ground looms and, later, vertical looms. Weaving on one of these looms was a physically demanding and tedious job. The weaver had to stand or crouch for hours, passing the shuttle back and forth, beating the weft threads tightly into place to create a dense, durable fabric. To create a simple dress for one person would require many, many hours of work, from retting the flax to the final stitch. For a poor family, their linen garments would be treasured possessions, worn until they were threadbare, then patched, and finally, when they could no longer be worn, recycled into bandages or wicks for lamps. Nothing was wasted. Now, consider the social implications of this fabric. Because the quality of linen varied so dramatically, it was an immediate and obvious indicator of social status. A high-ranking official and his wife would be dressed in linen so fine it was called woven air. It was semi-transparent, light, and brilliantly white from being sun-bleached. A common laborer's tunic, by contrast, would be made of a coarse, thick, and grayish linen, designed for durability rather than beauty. Simply by looking at the texture of a person's clothing, one could instantly gauge their place in the social hierarchy. The vast majority of clothing was left in its natural, undyed, off-white state. Dyes were expensive and often faded. A clean white garment was a sign of respectability. It showed that a woman had the time and the access to water to keep her family's clothes clean. No small feat in a dusty, pre-industrial world. Laundry was a major, physically demanding chore. It involved carrying the clothes to the river, scrubbing them with natron, a naturally occurring salt. If available, beating them against rocks, rinsing them, and then laying them out to dry. The idea of having a large wardrobe of clothes was unthinkable for anyone but the super rich. Most women would have owned only one or two dresses. This single garment would be worn day in and day out, while working, sleeping, and socializing. It would be a second skin, imbued with the smells and stains of daily life. Its texture, its weight, and the way it fell against her body would be as familiar to her as her own reflection. So, when we see the serene images of Egyptian women in their simple white dresses, we should remember the hidden labor embedded in the cloth. We should see the long, tedious hours of retting, scutching, spinning, and weaving. We should see the aching back of the weaver at her loom. We should see the woman at the riverbank, beating the dirt out of the fabric against a stone. The dress is not just a garment. It is a testament to her endless, often invisible work. It is a symbol of the immense effort required to create even the most basic necessities of life in the ancient world. Let's turn our attention to the end of the day. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the village, the pace of work would slow, but it would not stop. The men and older boys would be returning from the fields, or their workshops, tired and hungry. The evening meal would need to be prepared. This meal was often the main one of the day. It might consist of the bread baked that morning, accompanied by a stew of lentils or beans, flavored with onions, garlic, and herbs grown in the family garden. The cooking was done over an open hearth, either inside the house or in a courtyard. The smoke would fill the small living space, stinging the eyes and coating the walls with a thin layer of soot over time. The family would gather to eat, perhaps sitting on low stools or on mats on the floor. It was a time to come together, to share the food that had been so laboriously produced, and to talk about the day's events. The primary beverage for everyone, including children, was a weak, nutritious beer. This wasn't the strong, intoxicating beer we know today. It was thick, almost like a gruel, made from fermented barley or emmer wheat. It was a vital source of calories and nutrients, and it was generally safer to drink than the river water. A woman's work included brewing this beer for her family, a process that involved mashing bread or grain, adding water and a fermenting agent, and then straining the resulting liquid. After the meal, there was still work to be done. Pots needed to be cleaned, tools put away, and the house secured for the night. The evenings were dark. The only light came from the flickering flames of the hearth or from small, simple oil lamps, a pottery dish with a wick made from a piece of twisted linen floating in animal fat or castor oil. These lamps gave off a dim, smoky light, making any detailed work impossible. The darkness brought a sense of closure to the day, but it also brought its own set of fears. The night was believed to be a time when malevolent spirits were more active. The desert, which was never far away, was seen as a place of chaos and danger, home to dangerous animals and hostile forces. The night was a time to be inside, safe within the protective circle of the home, under the watchful eyes of the household gods like Bez. For a woman, the evening might bring a rare moment of respite. With the children asleep and the major chores of the day completed, she might have a moment to herself or with her husband. However, it was also a time of vulnerability. In the close confines of a small house, privacy was non-existent. Marital intimacy was not a private affair, but one that occurred in a room shared with sleeping children and other family members. The concept of personal space was a luxury few could imagine. Sleep itself was different. The idea of a solid 8-hour block of sleep is a relatively modern invention. Historical evidence suggests that many pre-industrial societies, including ancient Egypt, practiced a biphasic or segmented sleep pattern. People would go to sleep shortly after dusk, wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then go back to sleep until dawn. This period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, known as the watch, was a quiet, contemplative time. It might be used for prayer, for quiet conversation, or simply for lying awake and thinking. We can imagine Merit waking in the deep stillness of the night. The fire has died down to embers. The only sound is the rhythmic breathing of her family. She might think about the tasks of the coming day, worry about a sick child, or simply feel the profound quiet of the sleeping world around her. It might be the only time of day when she is truly alone with her thoughts, a brief, peaceful interlude in a life of constant labor and social interaction. She would sleep on a simple reed mat, perhaps with a thin mattress of straw. Her pillow would not be soft, but a hard, curved headrest made of wood or stone. These headrests seem incredibly uncomfortable to us, but they were common throughout Egyptian history. They had the practical advantage of keeping one's head elevated off the floor, away from dust and insects, and they also helped to protect the elaborate hairstyles or wigs of the elite from being crushed during sleep. For Merit, sleeping on this hard surface was simply normal. Her body was accustomed to it. Her sleep would not be the deep, untroubled rest we seek, but a lighter, more watchful state, her ears attuned to the cry of a baby or any unusual sound from outside. Her rest, like her work, was functional, a necessary recharging of a body that would be pushed to its limits again as soon as the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. The end of the day was not an escape from her life's brutality, but merely a pause within it. The legal framework surrounding divorce in ancient Egypt offers a fascinating glimpse into the society's pragmatic and surprisingly secular approach to marriage. As we've discussed, marriage was a social contract, not a religious sacrament, and therefore it could be broken. The process was, in theory, remarkably simple. Either partner could initiate the divorce by making a public declaration. We have records of the simple phrases used. "I have divorced you," or "Take for yourself a wife, for I am leaving you." The simplicity of the process, however, belies the complex and often difficult reality for the woman involved. A key element of the marriage agreement was the annuity. This was a contract drawn up at the time of marriage, in which the husband promised to provide his wife with a certain amount of food, clothing, and other goods for the rest of her life, even if they divorced. This was, in essence, a form of ancient alimony or child support, intended to ensure that a woman was not left destitute if the marriage ended. We have many of these contracts, and they show that the husband was legally obligated to provide for his ex-wife. This sounds like a robust system of protection, but once again, we must ask, how did this work in practice? For a wealthy couple, the annuity contract would be a serious legal document, and a divorced woman from a powerful family would have the means to enforce it. Her family could take her ex-husband to court if he failed to pay. But for our village woman, Merit, the situation would be far more tenuous. Her husband might be a subsistence farmer with little surplus wealth. His annuity might be a promise of a certain number of sacks of grain per year, a promise that would be difficult to keep if the harvest was poor. Enforcing the contract would mean going to the local court, a daunting prospect for an uneducated woman. She would have to challenge a man in a system run by men. It is likely that many of these annuity promises were simply ignored, leaving the divorced woman economically dependent on her own family. And what of the children? Typically, the children would go with the mother. This meant that she was not only responsible for supporting herself, but also for her children, with only the uncertain promise of support from her ex-husband. Returning to her father's house was the most common option, but it was not always a welcome one. She and her children would represent extra mouths to feed, an additional strain on a household that might already be struggling. This economic vulnerability was the single greatest deterrent to a woman seeking a divorce. No matter how unhappy she was, no matter if her husband was cruel or neglectful, the prospect of poverty was a powerful reason to stay. She had to weigh the misery of her current situation against the terrifying uncertainty of a future on her own. The reasons for divorce were varied. Adultery on the part of the wife was a common cause and was considered a serious offense. A woman found guilty of adultery could face harsh punishment, and she would forfeit her right to any of the marital property. Adultery by the husband, however, was viewed very differently. While it could be grounds for a wife to seek a divorce, it was not considered a serious crime. A man could have relationships with concubines or servants without any major social or legal repercussions, as long as the woman was not another man's wife. This double standard is a clear reflection of the patriarchal nature of the society, where the control of female sexuality and the certainty of paternity were paramount. The most common reason for a man to divorce his wife was barrenness. If a woman failed to produce a child, especially a son, after a few years of marriage, her husband was well within his rights to divorce her and marry someone else. This placed an immense and unfair burden on the woman, as the infertility was always assumed to be her fault. A woman who was divorced for being barren faced a particularly difficult future. She had failed in what was seen as her primary purpose, and she would have no children to support her in her old age. Her life would be one of social stigma and economic hardship. So while we can admire the legal sophistication and apparent fairness of Egyptian divorce law, we must temper that admiration with a healthy dose of reality. The law provided a door, but for most women, that door opened onto a cliff edge. The freedom it offered was a freedom to be poor, to be vulnerable, and to be a burden on one's family. For the vast majority of women, enduring a difficult marriage was simply the more rational choice, a testament not to the happiness of their unions, but to the brutal economic realities that underpin them. Let us consider the landscape of the sacred from a woman's perspective, moving beyond the household and the state temples to the very earth beneath her feet. The ancient Egyptians had a deeply animistic worldview. They saw divinity in the natural world around them. The river, the sun, the sky, the earth itself, all were imbued with sacred power. For a woman whose life was so intimately tied to the land and its cycles, this would have been a felt reality, not an abstract theology. The Nile, or Hapi, was personified as a male deity. But the river in its daily reality was a profoundly female space. The riverbank was where women gathered, worked, and socialized. It was the place of washing, both of clothes and of bodies. It was a place of cleansing and renewal, but it was also a place of danger. The same water that gave life could bring disease, and its placid surface could conceal the threat of crocodiles. This duality of nurturing and danger was a constant theme in a woman's life. The fields, the black land, were the source of sustenance. A woman might not plow the fields herself, but she was deeply connected to their fate. She would help with the harvest, gleaning the fallen ears of grain. She would pray to Renenutet, the cobra goddess of the harvest and granaries, to protect the food that would keep her family alive through the year. She would have an intimate knowledge of the plants in her small garden, knowing which leaves could be used to soothe a fever and which roots could ease a stomachache. This was a form of sacred knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter, a practical herbalism that blurred the line with magic. The desert, the red land, that loomed at the edge of every village, was a place of awe and terror. It was the land of Seth, the god of chaos and storms. It was a place of death, where the tombs were located, but also a place of eternity. The dry, sterile sand of the desert was what preserved the bodies of the dead, allowing for the possibility of rebirth. When a woman looked out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the desert, she would see a symbol of both annihilation and eternal life. Animals, too, were seen as manifestations of the divine. The cat, sacred to the goddess Bastet, was a common and beloved household pet. Cats were valued for their practical ability to protect the granaries from mice and rats, but they were also seen as symbols of grace, fertility, and divine protection. A woman would have treated the family cat with a mixture of affection and reverence. To harm a cat was a serious crime. The cow, sacred to the goddess Hathor, was a symbol of motherhood and nourishment. A family that owned a cow was considered wealthy. The cow's milk was a vital source of nutrition, and the animal itself would have been a cherished member of the household, tended to by the women of the family. Even seemingly insignificant creatures could hold sacred power. The scarab beetle, which was observed rolling a ball of dung across the sand, was associated with the god Khepri, who rolled the sun across the sky each day. The scarab became a powerful symbol of rebirth and regeneration, and amulets in its shape were worn by everyone. For a woman, this constant presence of the sacred in the mundane world would have shaped her perception of reality. Her life was not divided into the secular and the religious. Grinding grain was a sacred act because it sustained life. Giving birth was a sacred act, fraught with divine danger and power. The world was alive with meaning, and she was an active participant in this sacred drama. Her personal prayers were not addressed to a distant, transcendent God, but to the tangible forces that shaped her existence. The river that flowed past her door, the earth that provided her food, and the animals that shared her home. This intimate, earth-based spirituality was a source of great psychological resilience. In a life filled with hardship and uncertainty, it provided a sense of order and meaning. It gave her rituals to perform, amulets to wear, and gods to call upon. It did not make her life any less brutal, but it may have made it more bearable, framing her suffering and her joys within a grand, cosmic narrative in which she played an essential, if humble, part. The contrast between public image and private reality is a recurring theme in ancient Egypt, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the depiction of the family. In the formal art of tombs and temples, the family is presented as a serene and harmonious unit. The husband and wife are shown as a loving, respectful couple, often holding hands or with an arm around each other. Their children are depicted as obedient and affectionate, standing dutifully by their parents' side. This is the ideal, the perfect family that the deceased wished to project for all eternity. It is a form of propaganda, advertising their adherence to Ma'at, the cosmic principle of order, truth, and justice. The reality, of course, was far messier. The Egyptian household was often a crowded, multi-generational, and potentially tense environment. A typical home might contain a man and his wife, their unmarried children, their married sons with their wives and children, and perhaps some elderly parents or unmarried relatives. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist. Everyone lived in close quarters, sharing the same living and sleeping spaces. This enforced intimacy would have created a hotbed of potential conflict. A young wife, like our Merit, would have to navigate a complex web of relationships. Her most important relationship, and often the most difficult, would be with her mother-in-law. As the established mistress of the house, the older woman would hold all the authority. The young bride would be expected to be subservient, to learn her new family's ways, and to prove her worth through hard work and obedience. This could be a supportive, mentoring relationship, but it could also be one of friction and resentment. The young woman's every action would be judged by her mother-in-law, and any perceived failure could be a source of conflict. Then there were the relationships with her sisters-in-law, the wives of her husband's brothers. They would be her daily companions in labor, but also her rivals for resources and favor within the family. Competition and jealousy could easily fester in such close quarters. The relationship with her husband was the cornerstone of her new life, but it was also shaped by these wider family dynamics. A husband might be caught between his loyalty to his wife and his duty to his mother. The wisdom texts are full of advice from men on how to manage these relationships, urging them to be fair to their wives and to respect their mothers, a clear indication that this was a common source of domestic strife. The arrival of children would add another layer of complexity. While children were a source of joy and the fulfillment of a woman's primary duty, they were also another source of work and worry. A woman was not just a mother to her own children, but part of a collective of women raising all the children in the household. This could be a source of support, with aunts and grandmothers helping to care for the young ones. But it could also lead to disputes over favoritism or differing ideas about discipline. Life in the ancient Egyptian family was a constant negotiation of personalities, obligations, and emotions. It required a high degree of social skill and emotional resilience. A woman had to learn to hold her tongue, to pick her battles, and to build alliances within the family to protect her own position and the well-being of her children. The serene, smiling portraits on the tomb walls conceal this daily drama. They present a sanitized, idealized version of family life that served a specific religious and social purpose. But the reality for the living was one of noise, mess, conflict, and compromise. It was a life lived out in public, with every argument overheard and every action scrutinized. The home was not a peaceful sanctuary from the world, but a microcosm of it, with its own complex politics, power struggles, and moments of hard-won harmony. For a woman, successfully navigating this environment was one of the most important and challenging tasks of her life. Let's reconsider the physical space of the home. The typical Egyptian house, for the 90% of the population who were not elite, was a masterpiece of climate-adapted, resource-efficient design. But it was not a comfortable place by modern standards. It was built from the most abundant local material, Nile mud. The mud was mixed with straw or animal dung as a binder, pressed into wooden molds, and left to bake in the sun. These bricks were then used to build houses with thick walls that provided excellent insulation. The roofs were flat, made from a layer of palm logs, covered with reeds, and a thick coating of mud plaster. This flat roof was a vital extension of the living space. In the cool evenings, the family might sit on the roof to catch a breeze. It was also used for sleeping during the hot summer months, and for drying grain or other foodstuffs. The interior was dark. Windows were small, high slits in the wall, designed to let in a little light, while keeping out the intense heat and glare of the sun. The floor was simply hard-packed earth, sometimes covered with reed mats. This floor was a constant source of dust, and was difficult to keep clean. Furniture was sparse and functional. People slept on mats, or low-slung wooden beds with woven cord bases. They sat on three-legged stools, which were more stable on the uneven earthen floors than four-legged ones. Storage consisted of clay pots and wooden chests. The layout was simple. A common design for a villager's house featured a front room that might serve as a workshop or a space for greeting visitors. Beyond this was a central living room with a high ceiling and a hearth for cooking. The smoke from the fire would escape through a small hole in the roof. This central room was the heart of the home, where the family ate and socialized. To the back, there might be a bedroom and a small cellar dug into the ground for keeping food and water cool. Many homes had a small, walled courtyard, which was used for tasks like grinding grain, baking bread in an outdoor oven, and keeping small animals like chickens or a goat. The kitchen, if one could call it that, was not a separate room, but simply the area around the hearth. It was smoky, and the risk of fire was constant. The walls would become coated with a layer of soot over time. There was no running water. Every drop had to be hauled from the river or a well. There was no sanitation system. People would relieve themselves in a designated corner of the courtyard or in a pit, and waste was often simply thrown into the village street. This lack of sanitation, combined with the presence of animals and the plague of flies, created a breeding ground for disease. For a woman, this house was her primary domain, but it was also a relentless source of work. Keeping it even moderately clean was a daily, uphill battle against dust, soot, and pests. She had to be constantly vigilant against scorpions and snakes that might seek shelter in the cool, dark corners or in the thatch of the roof. The house was not a place of rest, but a workshop, a nursery, and a kitchen, all rolled into one. It was a functional, practical shelter, perfectly adapted to its environment, but it offered little in the way of comfort or privacy. Now, contrast this with the villa of our noblewoman, Nebet. Her house would be a sprawling, multi-roomed complex, built around a central garden courtyard with a pool. The walls would be plastered and painted with vibrant scenes from nature or daily life. The floors might be tiled. There would be separate rooms for different functions, a reception hall, a dining room, bedrooms, and bathrooms. The bathroom would be a small room with a limestone slab on which she could stand or squat while a servant poured water over her. The wastewater would drain away into a sand pit below. The house would have large latticed windows to allow for air circulation while still providing shade. The kitchen would be in a separate building at the back of the property to keep the smoke and smells away from the main living quarters. The entire complex would be surrounded by a high wall, ensuring privacy and security. For Nebet, the house was a symbol of her family's status and a place of comfort and leisure. For Merit, the house was a basic shelter and a demanding worksite. The very walls of their homes told the story of the vast social and economic gulf that separated them. Merit's house was a tool for survival. Nebet's house was a stage for a life of privilege. Let us pause and consider the sounds and smells that would have composed the sensory world of an ancient Egyptian woman. Our modern world is saturated with the noise of machinery, traffic, and electronic media. Her world would have been both quieter and, in some ways, more intensely sensory. The baseline sound of a village would have been one of human and animal activity. The rhythmic scraping of dozens of saddle querns in the morning, a gritty, percussive sound that was the heartbeat of the community. The chatter and laughter of women at the well, the shouts of children playing, the braying of donkeys, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of goats, and the cackling of geese. From the workshops would come the clang of a coppersmith's hammer or the rasp of a carpenter's saw. From the river, the calls of fishermen mending their nets. At dusk, the sounds would soften to the murmur of conversations within homes, the crackle of cooking fires, and the gentle chirping of crickets. The silence of the deep night would be profound, broken only by the bark of a dog or the lonely cry of a nocturnal bird. The smells would have been equally potent and evocative. The dominant smell was of the earth itself, the dry dust of the desert edge, the rich, damp smell of the Nile mud after the flood, the scent of sun-baked mudbricks. Intermingled with this would be the smells of daily life, the sharp, smoky scent of wood and dried dung fires, the warm, comforting aroma of baking bread, the sour, yeasty smell of brewing beer, the pungent, sharp notes of garlic and onions, the staples of the Egyptian diet, the smell of livestock, goats, cattle, poultry, which often lived in close proximity to, or even inside, the house, the smell of human sweat, unmasked by modern deodorants, the cloying sweetness of perfume and scented oils worn by those who could afford them, a stark contrast to the everyday smells of labor, the metallic tang of blood from a slaughtered animal or from a wound, the foul stench of waste in the village street, and the ever-present, sickly smell of decay, a reminder of the constant proximity of death. For a woman, these sounds and smells were the unquestioned background of her existence. They were the context for her labor, her joys, and her sorrows. They were the sensory cues that told her what time of day it was, what season it was, and what was happening in her community. A change in the smell of the air could herald a coming dust storm. The sound of wailing from a neighbor's house would be an instant signal of a death in the community. This sensory immersion was total and unavoidable. There were no sealed windows to keep out the smells, no headphones to block out the noise. Life was lived in a rich and often overwhelming sensory soup. This world, so different from our own, required a different kind of attention, a constant, low-level monitoring of the environment through all the senses. A woman would be attuned to the subtle shifts in this sensory landscape in a way that we can barely imagine. It was a skill essential for survival, for managing her household, and for participating in her community. To truly understand her life, we must try to imagine not just what she saw, but what she heard, what she smelled, and what she felt on her skin. The searing heat of the sun, the cool of the water pot against her shoulder, the scratch of her linen dress, and the grit of sand in her mouth. In conclusion, the life of a woman in ancient Egypt was a study in profound contradictions. She lived in a civilization that produced some of the most breathtaking art and architecture the world has ever known. Yet her own existence was largely defined by mundane, repetitive labor. She was a legal person with rights to property and divorce that were centuries ahead of her time. Yet she lived under a deeply entrenched patriarchal system that limited her practical freedom at every turn. She was the center of the family, revered as a mother and the mistress of the house. Yet she was subjected to the constant, life-threatening dangers of childbirth and the profound grief of losing her children. Her world was rich with sacred meaning, with gods and goddesses who walked beside her in her daily life. Yet this same belief system could also be a source of terror, attributing every misfortune to a divine curse or a magical attack. Was her life brutal? By any modern standard, the answer is an unequivocal yes. It was physically brutal, marked by backbreaking labor that began in childhood and ended only in old age or death. It was biologically brutal, with her body subjected to an endless cycle of pregnancy and birth with little medical support. It was emotionally brutal, filled with the anxiety of survival and the near certainty of burying some of her own children. But to label it only as brutal is to risk missing the full picture. It was also a life of incredible resilience, strength, and agency within its narrow confines. The women of ancient Egypt were not simply passive victims. They were the weavers of the social fabric, the managers of the household economy, the primary caregivers, and the keepers of the family's spiritual flame. They built communities, navigated complex social politics, and found ways to create beauty and joy in a harsh world. They were the silent, uncelebrated partners in the building of their civilization. Their strength was not the heroic strength of a warrior king, but the quiet, enduring strength of a reed in the wind, bending, but not breaking. As we leave this ancient world, let's hold on to this complex image. Picture Merit, not just at her grinding stone, but also laughing with her friends at the river, holding her sleeping child with fierce tenderness, and finding a moment of peace under a canopy of stars so bright and clear they seemed close enough to touch. Her life was a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure, to adapt, and to find meaning even in the most difficult of circumstances. It is a story that is at once remote and deeply, universally human. And now, there is nothing left to do but rest. The work of the day is done. The village is quiet. The great river flows on, as it always has, and the desert keeps its ancient secrets. It's time to let the dust settle and drift away.